Lecture 5, Wojtek, Bear, World War II. A 3-month Syrian brown bear cub survives by doing two things well: sucking milk and sleeping in somebody else's fur. And in early April 1942, outside Hamadan in the Zagros foothills, one of those services ended when hunters killed his mother. In a normal den, a brown bear mother drops blind cubs in midwinter at under a kilogram, pins them to her belly, and turns fat heavy milk into both growth and heat while she keeps the outside world away with sheer bulk and temper. This orphan had to push his nose into cold air, shiver through high desert nights, and spend calories just holding a core temperature that should have been subsidized by maternal insulation. By the time a local boy knotted him into a burlap sack and walked toward a Polish transport column near Hamadan, spring 1942, trucks idling, soldiers smoking, the animal inside wasn't a legend, just a squeaking metabolic emergency. On the 8th of April, 1942, in the refugee sprawl outside Hamadan, Corporal Piotr Prentice squatted by a truck wheel, untied the sack cord, and watched a bear cub tumble out on shaky paws like a toddler designed by a weapons bureau. In the versions that align across Wisław Lasocki's later memoir and Zdzisław Zaleski's 1945 account, the boy offered a straight trade, one cub for food, because sentiment doesn't fill a stomach in wartime Persia. Prentice handed over tins of preserved meat and biscuits from company stores, then immediately faced the next constraint: his unit was scheduled to move, not build a nursery. Lieutenant Antoni Cholkowski, responsible for the 22nd Artillery Supply Company's discipline and its standing with British hosts, didn't draft a manifesto. He simply let Prentice hoist the cub into a canvas pack and told the men to keep him alive and out of trouble. The transaction's details are unusually sturdy because 3 different kinds of witnesses wrote them down while the century was still young. Zaleski set the story on paper in 1945, Lasocki returned to it in his later memoir, and a British liaison officer sent his own account to Polish Forces News in 1943. All 3 agree on the same physical choreography: sack opened, tins exchanged, cub carried off, while disagreeing on trivia like whether the seller was a boy or, in some retellings, a young girl. Even the date wobbles at the edges, with spring 1942 certain but some memories drifting toward late March, which is exactly why a contemporaneous camp register in Persia is useful as an anchor instead of a joke. It's the kind of variance you expect when men recall war through sand, hunger, and decades, and it doesn't change the operative fact that the bear entered the unit through an exchange of food for a life. Prentice kept the cub alive with soldier equipment. He boiled water in a dented mess tin, then sweetened condensed milk until it flowed, and poured it into a glass vodka bottle because the neck fit a bear's mouth and there was no baby gear in a transport company. He held the bottle high enough to keep Wojtek from sucking air and low enough to keep him from aspirating liquid into his lungs, a crude but real nursing technique when pneumonia in an Iranian camp could turn fatal fast. They named him Wojtek, everyday Wojtek, joyful warrior, a gallows laugh of a name chosen by men who had already learned what institutions do to bodies. In letters Prentice later wrote about those first weeks, he returns to the same action: Wojtek crying when left alone and a soldier staying in the tent with a hand on fur until the distress stopped, because separation calls burn energy and attract trouble. When the unit rolled out of Iran toward Iraq, the men slid an ammunition crate under a tent pole, lined it with blankets, and created a traveling bear bed, warmth, containment, and proof the cub was being packed as carefully as kit. The bear's existence leaked fast from tent gossip into the paper world that keeps armies from dissolving. An April 1942 refugee camp register, preserved in Imperial War Museum holdings, records a bear traveling with the Polish transport men, filed like a stove or stretcher. Some British administrator had to hear Cholkowski say, "Mascot, look at the cub," and choose the path of least work by stamping the form instead of starting a zoological incident. That small act mattered, because it meant British officers in Baghdad could later watch Poles march past with a bear on a leash in summer 1942 and treat it as odd but permitted rather than as contraband worth confiscating. When a British liaison officer eventually described the spectacle for Polish Forces News in 1943, Polish soldiers in the Middle East with their bear and leash, he was writing down what bureaucracy had already agreed to tolerate. In Baghdad that summer, the scene played like a documentary era. Polish soldiers marched past British officers, and beside them a bear cub padded along with a leash clipped to a collar, ears flicking at truck engines and street noise. The leash wasn't theatrical. In a city full of lorries and rifles, it was a safety device that stopped one startled lunge from turning into an accident or a shooting. Wojtek moved with the column anyway, nose down, sampling the sharp smells of fuel, grease, and unfamiliar people, because a bear's primary instrument is scent and curiosity is how juveniles learn a map. Prentice used his voice as a homing beacon, tightening the lead when the cub drifted and relaxing it when he stayed close. reinforcing the simplest survival rule an orphan can learn: proximity earns food and warmth. From the shade, the British observers weren't just amused, they were calculating risk, and their non-intervention tells you how 1942 Iraq worked. Administration triaging bigger fires and letting one improbable animal pass if it didn't explode the schedule. Those British men were watching Poles in 1942 because Poland had been cut apart with rulers 3 years earlier, and the cutting required a lot of hands doing physical work. On the 1st of September, 1939 German units drove in from the west. On the 17th of September the Red Army pushed in from the east under the Molotov-Ribbentrop arrangement, turning the Crécy into a trap where civilians were squeezed between two occupation systems. NKVD officers knocked on doors, read out names, and marched families to railheads where deportation trains waited with barred windows, then scattered the passengers across labor camps and forced settlements from Kazakhstan to the Arctic. By the time Prendis and Chilkowski were moving trucks through Iran, many of their men had already carried their own possessions in sacks, stepped into boxcars, and watched the platform vanish, because the Soviet state treated Polish citizenship as something you could relocate by paperwork and steel wheels. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, Stalin suddenly needed allies more than prisoners, and the pivot arrived in ink before it arrived in calories. On the 30th of July, 1941, Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski's government in exile and Ambassador Ivan Mayski signed the Sikorski-Mayski Agreement, calling the release of Polish citizens an amnesty, as if the Soviets were forgiving a crime rather than reversing an abduction. Camp gates opened, prison doors unlocked, and General Władysław Anders walked out of the Lubyanka to assemble a Polish army on Soviet soil out of men who were half-starved, sick, and furious. In places like Buzuluk and Totskoy, officers wrote rosters, issued scavenged uniforms, and tried to turn survivors into units while dysentery and frostbite competed with rifle training for attention. That background is sitting inside the Baghdad Bear scene. The men feeding Wojtek weren't adding whimsy to a normal life, they were practicing care in a world that had tried to delete them. By 1942 the Polish army inside the USSR was underfed and politically radioactive, and Stalin solved both problems by allowing evacuation to Persia under British control, get the mouths out and let London equip them elsewhere. In the movement veterans later called the Anders Exodus, more than 70,000 Polish soldiers and civilians moved south in waves, crossing into Iran and landing at Pahlavi on the Caspian coast with typhus scars, improvised luggage, and a reflexive suspicion of every uniform. British officers processed them through camps, issued rations, and tried to sort artillerymen from infantry while refugees washed in cold water and burned lice-infested clothes, because a liberated army that brings an epidemic is still a problem army. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company reformed inside that machinery, drivers checking tires and fuel, Chilkowski inspecting loads, Prendis tying down ropes, and learned the geography of Iran and Iraq one junction at a time. So when they traded tins for a cub on the 8th of April, 1942 near Hamadan, they did it while the larger Polish migration around them kept moving by the same method, bodies walking, collapsing, standing up again, and refusing to disappear. Iran and Iraq in 1942 were infrastructure as much as geography. After the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in August 1941, the Persian corridor funneled Lend-Lease goods to the USSR, turning rail yards and roads into strategic anatomy. Men in British and Soviet uniforms waved traffic through checkpoints, wrote serial numbers on crates, and watched winches swing everything from canned food to truck parts into place, because war at that scale is a choreography of objects. The 22nd Company lived inside that choreography, so calling Wojtek an unofficial mascot was also a way of labeling a new logistical variable, an animal that ate, drank, and could wreck the schedule if it panicked. The first rule of keeping him was the same as the first rule of moving ammunition: reduce surprises. Mascots slipped into Allied camps because bored, stressed humans adopt anything that fits in a tent and then dare the institution to stop them. Polish soldiers carried their own precedent, Baska the bear cub mascot from the First World War, so a bear in a unit didn't feel like sacrilege to men raised around animals and folk memory. What was new was scale. A bear stops being cute on a schedule measured in months, and the decision to keep one has to be remade every time his shoulders broaden. Chilkowski managed that risk by doing what officers do. He reframed affection as utility, justifying the cub up the chain as morale equipment in a displaced unit, while the British, who tolerated their own pet gazelles and monkeys in Iran, let the experiment continue as long as it didn't bite a child or delay a convoy. Later memoirists like Lasocki remembered not slogans but protocols, leashes, feeding rules, who slept where, because those are the actions that kept the story from ending in gunfire. Weaning was the first milestone veterans pinned to a date. By October 1942, around 8 months old, the men began swapping the vodka bottle for solid food because a bear with teeth would eventually decide nipples are optional. They set porridge and bread in mess tins, let him lick honey and marmalade from spoons, and watched his gut adapt, because an orphan raised on condensed milk has to rebuild digestion for starch and fiber. The camp diet shaped temperament as much as mass. Scraps appeared when soldiers were generous and vanished when they were tired, which taught Wojtek that humans were both resource and boundary. Someone offered him beer from a canteen, nutritionally idiotic but socially brilliant, a ritual of inclusion in a British-controlled camp in Iraq where boredom and grief needed something to lean on. By late 1942 he was already heavy enough that every shared snack was also a quiet vote to keep managing the consequences of a growing bear. On the 24th of December, 1942, at Camp Winters in Iraq, the company tried to perform Wigilia, the Polish Christmas Eve meal, by laying out jam, bacon, eggs, and whatever else could be hoarded long enough to pretend it was home. Wojtek smelled concentrated calories through canvas, shouldered into the food storage tent, and treated the feast like a buffet designed for an omnivore, scattering tins and smearing syrupy mess across the ground. Veterans remembered the number because it made the crime physically plausible. By that winter he was described as roughly 70 kilograms, too heavy to drag out by hand and strong enough to knock a man over without meaning to. The men didn't beat him and they didn't shrug, they ringed him, clapped, wagged fingers, and repeated, "No wall no, not allowed," until the sound itself became a cue that access to food now came with social rules. It was comedy only in the way an accident report is comedy, because the lesson was operational, affection requires discipline, and a holiday in 1942 Iraq could be wrecked by an adolescent learning what no feels like. In early 1943, still in the Iraqi camps of Andus Army, a cook in the 22nd Company learned the difference between tame and domesticated, when Wojtek played a forearm hard enough to leave bruises, grabbing for food the way a juvenile bear grabs for everything. Lasocki's recollection makes Chelkowski look less like a killjoy and more like a safety officer. He ordered the men to stop hand-feeding and to place food down or toss it from a short distance, building a margin so excitement couldn't turn into an accidental bite. The rule respected anatomy. Bear mouths are hands with teeth, built for crushing and tearing, and it also respected learning. Once it held, Wojtek discovered that waiting brought food and lunging brought social withdrawal. For transport soldiers who lived by load discipline and predictable interfaces, it was familiar logic: reduce failure modes, keep fingers away from teeth, and you don't end the day filling out a report titled, Bear Incident. In the large Iraqi camp shared with other Allied personnel, including in some recollections women of the British Auxiliary Territorial Service, Wojtek found a new kind of ration line, laundry strung between poles, heavy with human scent and fluttering like prey. He rose on hind legs, hooked a stretch of undergarments with a forepaw, and loped off with the line dragging behind him, turning domestic routine into a perimeter incident that guaranteed somebody's superior would be told. The behavior was pure juvenile bear, grab, run, enjoy the pursuit, driven by an olfactory brain that treats sweaty fabric as a high-value curiosity object. Somewhere nearby, a staff officer pinched the bridge of his nose, because the risk wasn't morality, it was optics in 1942, when the Poles needed British patience more than they needed a bear's opinion about underwear. As Wojtek grew through late 1942 into 1943, he started copying work the way a child copies adults, which is less cute than a clue about how he learned. When men of the 22nd Company in Iraq went out to gather firewood, veterans recall the bear ambling behind them with branches in his mouth or cradled between forepaws, then dropping the bundle where the men dropped theirs, as if he wanted his share of the credit. He did the same with camp gear, tugging a canvas top, nosing at ropes, trying to carry whatever he saw humans carrying, because mimicry plus attention is a powerful reinforcement loop in a smart omnivore. Prentice and the other handlers had to redirect that urge before it turned into theft of tools or breakage of equipment, so they guided him towards safe objects, praised the helping, and pulled him off anything sharp or mission critical. The wrestling stories from 1942 and 1943 are not bedtime fluff, they are a description of how a bear learned the limits of his own power inside a human pack. Men in the 22nd Company squared up with Wojtek on open sand, and he stood on hind legs like a boxer, forepaws raised, shifting weight with the agility that makes experienced hunters respect bears more than they fear wolves. They shoved his chest, he shoved back, and when his claws tore a sleeve or his teeth closed too hard on a boot, the men yelped and broke contact, providing the same feedback littermates give in a den. Across Polish veterans' later interviews and the scattered British observer notes that bother to mention bruises, you don't get a consistent story of mauling, which is significant because one serious injury would have ended the experiment instantly in an armed camp. Play was not the opposite of discipline, it was the mechanism by which restraint got installed, one shove and one reprimand at a time. Underneath the mischief ran quieter labor that built the bond, Prentice wrapping Wojtek in blankets at night, lifting him when the convoy moved, and sitting close when the cub's crying spiked because he couldn't find his attachment figure. That crying wasn't acting, it was a mammalian distress call that floods the body with stress hormones and burns glucose, and in an orphan it can be lethal if nobody responds. Every time a soldier answered the noise with warmth inside a tent in Iran or Iraq, the cub's nervous system filed the lesson under safe, and the attachment circuit strengthened the same way it does in human infants. The company's daily cycle, reveille, engines, mess line, sleep, became the bear's developmental environment, and animals raised in one environment don't form friendships in the abstract so much as they internalize predictable patterns of care. By the time Wojtek followed Prentice through camp dust like a puppy, the relationship wasn't mystical, it was built from thousands of small physical rescues from cold, hunger, and loneliness. By spring 1943 the 22nd Artillery Supply Company shifted into Palestine for training near Gaza, and the bear stopped being an internal Polish eccentricity and became visible to anyone who walked through an Allied camp. At Castina in April 1943, veterans described Wojtek climbing into the cab of a Chevrolet 1500 weight truck and riding up front beside the driver, panting in heat that turns a fur coat into a liability. The truck detail is logistics, not decoration. A bear that rides instead of chasing wheels is a bear less likely to get crushed, and a bear habituated to engines is less likely to panic when a convoy moves at dawn. In that same camp an English liaison officer kept a Dalmatian, and multiple recollections insist the dog and bear circled, sniffed, chased, and then settled into a wary friendship that made soldiers relax around an animal capable of breaking a man's ribs by accident. Every outsider who watched Wojtek respond to a shouted stop or climb down when waved off added another layer of informal permission for the unit to keep him. Castina also produced the mishap that lives forever because it is both stupid and operational. Wojtek scrambled up a telegraph or signal pole and, by sheer climbing enthusiasm, caused a communications outage in April 1943. A bear climbs because claws and weight distribution make vertical with negotiable terrain, and once he was up there the usual human solution, shouting, had no traction. The transport men improvised like they always did with broken gear. They wrapped a rope around the pole, left enough slack to act as a brake, and let the bear slide down under control instead of dropping, converting panic into friction. When he hit the ground and shook dust from his coat, they ran the now standard routine, finger wagging and "na wolno," because consistency is what teaches an animal that some parts of camp are not playgrounds. Somewhere a signalman reconnected a line and wrote an annoyed note, and a bear briefly became a variable in Allied communications discipline. Back in camp, the relationship hardened into routine, which is how mammals tame each other. Men poured porridge into a washtub, called the bear over, and watched him eat like a shaggy recruit who had missed the memo about table manners. Accounts from 1943 say he woke when reveille sounded and ambled toward the mess area as if the trumpet were a feeding bell, because habituation is just the nervous system downgrading a repeated stimulus from threat to background. Living with an artillery supply unit also meant living with noise, engines, metal crates dropped on truck beds, and his startle reflex got rewritten by repetition, the same way a human conscript does. On one desert move through Syria remembered in a British officer's note, men cooled themselves by splashing water on skin and Wojtek copied them by rolling in wet sand and lying flat, pressing his belly to a damp surface that pulled heat away. Prentice didn't run formal training, he repeated boundaries until the bear predicted consequences, and then rewarded the right prediction with calm touch and food. The cleanest ritual the unit developed was also the strangest. A man would extend a hand and say, "Dodge Lape," and Wojtek would lift a forepaw into the grip like a handshake, an interaction captured in camp photographs and repeated until it stuck. On the surface it was slapstick, in practice it was a safety script, one predictable point of contact instead of fingers wandering toward a mouth built to crush bone. Veterans describe using the gesture to break in newcomers to the 22nd Company in 1943. If the bear accepted you, the humans relaxed, and the newcomer learned that fear could be managed by ritual. The handshake also did instant public relations, letting British visitors swap "wild bear" for a rehearsed scene of controlled contact, which mattered in a camp where rumor traveled faster than orders. A predictable paw was easier to circulate than a nuanced explanation of animal behavior. The unit's discipline mattered because other mascots proved how fast the story can curdle, and the cautionary example sits in the same theater. A bear named Mikel, kept elsewhere in the Middle East, was shipped to the Tel Aviv zoo after biting a child. That isn't evil bear so much as mismatch. An animal raised with inconsistent limits treats hands as toys until a hand belongs to someone too small to read warning signs. Chelkowski's order after Wojtek bruised the cook and the company's relentless "Nie wolno" were, in that light, failure prevention. The same behavior must always trigger the same consequence or the animal never learns a stable rule. When Wojtek tested limits, raiding food, hauling laundry, climbing poles, the men corrected him, withdrew attention, and restored contact when he settled, shaping behavior through social access instead of terror. That subtle method is what kept a growing bear in an armed camp from ending his own story with a rifle shot. What survives of these early months is a chain of physical traces made by tired hands, camp paperwork preserved in London, photographs of a paw offered like a handshake, and memoir pages by Lasocki and other 22nd Company men written after the sand was out of their boots. A historian can open the archive box, follow the trail of dates and unit names, and feel the strange relief of bureaucracy, one sterile entry that keeps the bear from drifting into pure folklore. From there, you reverse engineer the legend by reconstructing the actions it required: boiling water, carrying a cub in a pack, enforcing distance at feeding, keeping a leash on in a crowded Iraqi city, until the story stops sounding magical and starts sounding laborious. Wojciech's origin is credible not because humans love myths, but because someone did the boring work every day that makes a bear's survival in an army physically possible. By mid-1943 Wojtek was no longer portable in any meaningful sense. He was an adolescent bear with the mass to shove a man against his will and the curiosity to treat every camp as a puzzle box. He moved with the 22nd Company through Palestine and Syria as if the unit were a traveling den stitched from canvas and trucks, climbing onto flatbeds when drivers waved him up and dropping back to the road when the convoy slowed. At night Prentice still threw a blanket over him inside the circle of tents, less for warmth now than as a physical insistence that the bear belonged on the human side of the perimeter, where guards could see him and strangers wouldn't mistake him for a threat. At dawn, when engines coughed and men started loading crates, Wojtek rose, shook dust from his fur, and trotted after the rolling column with his nose working the wind off the next camp like it was something he intended to open and explore. In mid-1943, Corporal Piotr Prentice plants his boots in the hardpan outside a camp line near Gaza and shortens Wojciech's chain by 2 links, because a bear that has stopped being a cub can turn slack into speed. The Syrian brown bear rises to his hind legs, tests the tension with a shoulder like a battering ram, and noses at a stack of wooden crates as if they're toys instead of someone's ammunition boxes. Prentice shifts his grip to keep the chain from soaring across his palm, and the motion is a tiny mechanical truth. Once the animal is big enough, control stops being affection and starts being leverage management. Somewhere behind them, a truck engine idles, and Wojciech swivels his head toward the sound with the same reflex that makes him follow convoys like they're a moving den. When the 22nd Artillery Supply Company breaks camp again in the summer heat, men fold canvas, lash tool rolls, and throw kit into lorry beds in the same sequence they've repeated across Palestine and Syria, and they leave a gap for the heaviest piece of unofficial equipment. A private bangs the tailgate twice as a cue, and Wojciech hauls his front half up, claws scraping wood, then drags the rest of his mass over the lip with a grunt that makes the boards flex. 2 soldiers brace crates with their knees so the load doesn't shift under the bear's weight, because a sliding box becomes a sharp edge and a sharp edge becomes infection when you're living in dust. Prentice rides in the back with him, one hand on a leash clipped to a harness, the other hand free to push his shoulder away from a jerrycan of fuel, because even a friendly bear becomes a fire hazard when he gets curious. Port said, December 1943, the war becomes geometry. British depot staff chalk rectangles on the quay and herd men, trucks, and pallets into them as if drawing lines can stop a supply system from dissolving into chaos, and the Polish 2 Corps submits because ships don't accept arguments, only manifests. Lieutenant Antoni Chelkowski carries a folder of company paperwork up to a British desk, unit rosters, embarkation lists, transport allotments, and watches an officer's eye snag on the moving brown mass behind him. The refusal doesn't need to be shouted, it arrives as a finger tapping a form and then pointing at the bear, a bureaucratic gesture that says the same thing in every language: not on my ship. Wojciech, oblivious, leans into a soldier's hip and sniffs at a coil of rope, turning a port into a risk scene by simply existing. Chelkowski leaves the British desk, sets his folder on a crate, and tells a clerk to open the company ledger right there on the port said key in December 1943. He has Wojciech entered as Private Wojciech, assigned to the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, because embarkation regulations understand soldiers and do not understand mascots. The clerk writes the name, allocates a serial number, and drafts the kind of paper veterans later described as a paybook so the bear can be counted, rationed, and moved without anyone pretending he doesn't exist. A supply sergeant then fights the arithmetic in tins and bread, because a bear closing on 250 kilograms will either be fed deliberately or will feed himself violently. That reclassification shows up in the one place where myth has trouble hiding, the paper trail. In Alexandria in February 1944, British port records and transport manifests list one bear unit mascot attached to the Polish contingent on the SS Batory, a sterile line that survives because clerks preserve problems by naming them. Somebody stamps that sheet, and the stamp matters more than later folklore about promotions and salaries, because stamps are how a bureaucracy admits responsibility. The men also pose him for photographs in 1943 and 1944, truck beds, camp lanes, bottles pressed to a muzzle, building a visual record that keeps the story from evaporating into pure campfire talk. When modern researchers, Krzysztof Mikowski and Christina Mikula-Degan in 2011, for example, chase the story through archives, they treat the enlistment as real in effect while warning that the more cinematic details don't leave clean orders behind. The safest claim is the dullest one: the bear was documented well enough to get through the gate. On the 13th of February, 1944, Alexandria's dock turns the abstract into leather, steel, and heat. Prentice fits a muzzle over Wojtek's snout and tugs the straps until the leather holds firm without crushing airflow, because a panting bear is a cooling system and you don't sabotage cooling in North African sun. He clips the leash to an improvised harness, extra control points across chest and shoulders, not just neck, because the animal's body is too strong to steer with a collar alone. Soldiers form a human corridor down the dock, keeping curious sailors and port workers at distance with elbows and shouted warnings, and they walk the bear toward the SS Batory as if escorting an explosive, slow and deliberate. Wojtek pauses at the gangplank, sniffs the tarred wood and salt air, then climbs because he's been conditioned to follow the men who feed him, and a conditioned follow beats fear when the scent map changes. They build hardware to match the paperwork, because paper doesn't restrain muscle. Men hammer together a wooden crate big enough for the bear to lie down, brace the corners with extra timber, and drill holes for rope lashings, because a ship's roll can turn any loose object into a projectile. They stencil the crate with the 22nd Company's designation and his name, Wojtek, bear, making an accidental poem in block letters that reads like the war trying to normalize the impossible. Prentice uses food and voice to coax the bear inside, and the technique is quietly scientific: a bear pushed will resist, a bear lord will choose, and a chosen action is more stable under stress than a forced one. When they shut the crate and tie it down on deck, they're not just transporting an animal, they are reducing sensory input so the bear's nervous system has fewer triggers to misinterpret as threat. At sea, the Mediterranean tests every assumption about control. Engines transmit a low-frequency vibration through the deck that a bear's bones feel continuously, winches squeal, steel resonates, and salt air carries unfamiliar odors that keep an omnivore alert even when it's tired. Prentice cracks the crate door only when the deck is clear, then walks Wojtek in a tight loop on a short leash so the animal can urinate and reorient without drifting toward strangers. Men feed him after calm behavior: bread, fruit when it's available, the occasional sweet treat, because reinforcement is easier than force and because a bear that is hungry is a bear that improvises. Each time Wojtek leans toward a sailor or a loose coil of line, Prentice redirects him with body position and leash tension, shaping behavior the way you shape any large animal: reward the calm, interrupt the escalation. Never let a mistake become an incident that teaches the wrong lesson. Early 1944, Taranto, ramps drop and the Italian campaign begins as logistics before it begins as legend. Trucks grind off the ship, tires thumping onto stone, and the 22nd Company drags the bear's crate down a ramp with ropes the way they'd drag a stubborn gun carriage, because the company's skill is moving awkward heavy things through hostile environments. Wojtek steps onto the dock and lifts his nose into a new odor map: coal smoke, wet stone, unfamiliar food, while soldiers tighten their grip because novelty can flip even a habituated animal into bolt behavior. Jelkowski walks ahead to argue space for his unit's vehicles, and Prentice keeps the bear's head turned away from crowds, because the fastest way to get a bear shot is to let him surprise someone who has a rifle and no context. The war has changed continents again, and the first task is simply to get the bear off the dock without becoming the headline of an Allied safety memo. That risk becomes obvious in a near-miss veterans keep retelling because it compresses the whole hazard into one raised rifle. In March 1944 near the casino sector, an Indian sepoy on perimeter duty hears heavy movement, catches a bear-shaped mass, and snaps his weapon up the way training demands. Polish soldiers rush in, yank the leash hard, and drag Wojtek into the light before the sepoy fires, because in a multinational rear area silhouettes are interpreted fast and mercy comes later. The memoirs disagree on the exact camp and the exact wording: normal for a night incident, but they agree on the operational conclusion. Each time the bear crosses into unfamiliar units, the margin between mascot and corpse is the length of a trigger pull. Chelkowski spreads the bear handling protocol the way armies spread doctrine, by turning it into a repeatable physical routine. He orders soldiers to approach from the side, to let the bear smell first without dangling fingers, to keep faces out of reach when the animal rises upright, and to never offer food and then snatch it back, because that's how you teach any mammal to guard resources with teeth. Prentice demonstrates leash discipline, short enough to prevent a charge, long enough to avoid triggering panic, and he corrects men who treat the bear like a dog, because dogs accept hierarchy and bears negotiate it. The unit enforces no wrestling unless a handler is present, a rule that sounds absurd until you picture a bored private trying to prove courage by grappling with 200 kilograms of muscle. Every new arrival learns the rules by watching somebody get swatted, not out of malice but out of scale. A playful bear can injure without intending to, and intent doesn't matter to a medic. Chelkowski isn't sentimental about the protocol. He can see the downstream effect in fewer emergencies, the way an officer sees a well-maintained truck in fewer breakdowns. In the Middle East staging grounds in 1942 and 1943, British and Allied camps fill with smaller mascots because men keep feeding whatever lingers near a cookhouse. A private flicks scraps to a dog that has learned the noon routine. A gazelle kept near a British unit in Iran takes bread from a palm because it has been habituated to humans and cannot outrun barbed wire and boredom. In North Africa, stories circulate of a cheetah kept by a unit long enough for photographs, and in at least one South African formation a lion cub functions as both entertainment and an imperial brag made of fur. Even in Italy, the anecdotal record around casino keeps coughing up a donkey called Murphy, shuffling under sacks because a donkey can survive on scraps and still go where a truck bogs down. Across Allied camps, animals appear because men feed anything that lingers near a cookhouse, but the moment an army needs real labor it reaches for domesticated reliability. Mule handlers in the Apennines tighten pack saddles, redistribute loads by hand, and keep the column moving through mud and shell holes where trucks sink to their axles, because a mule's hooves and stubbornness outperform horsepower when roads are pinions. Signal troops loft pigeons because wires get cut and radios fail under terrain. A corporal slides a penciled message into a capsule, tosses the bird into air, and waits for homing instinct to do what a wireless set cannot. Dogs get manuals, standardized commands, and jobs: guarding, message running, sentry work, because you can predict a trained dog better than you can predict a bored bear. Polish military culture makes that irrationality slightly more legible. In camp lanes and improvised mess areas, older soldiers tell stories about Baska, a bear cub mascot attached to earlier Polish formations, and the retelling acts like a permission slip. A bear can exist in soldier memory as companion, not just as quarry. Chelkowski doesn't cite tradition in paperwork, but tradition lubricates compliance. A lieutenant can enforce boundaries more easily when the boundaries feel like they belong to a shared narrative. General Władysław Anders' exile army is hungry for symbols that don't require speeches, and a bear that follows the company around like a stubborn child offers one automatically. Every time a soldier uses the bear's presence as a joke, a comfort, or a rallying point, he is doing culture work with his hands, turning survival into something that can be talked about without cracking. Even inside mascot culture, the distinction is brutal. A patch costs cloth, a living bear costs calories and time. In Italy in early 1944, cooks pry open tins with bayonets and slide extra portions toward Prender's corner, because an omnivore weighing well over 200 kilograms burns fuel just staying big. When fruit, honey, or marmalade appears, men hand it over as fast energy and as a behavioral bribe that buys calm in a crowded camp. Beer turns up as a treat because soldiers remember it, not because it's nutritionally smart, and every indulgence carries the same unspoken logic: if you don't feed him, he will feed himself by raiding someone else's stores. Water is a sharper constraint than food in the places the 22nd Company passed through, and the bear forces that truth into action. In Iraq and Egypt, men ration water by the canteen and watch their own urine darken, yet still pour extra into a bucket because dehydration ruins an animal's thermoregulation and turns it unpredictable. When Wojtek refuses plain water, soldiers soak bread to sneak fluid into him, a small behavioral hack that matters because it's evidence of observation. Someone noticed the bear would drink if the water tasted like food. In Italy, the climate shifts and sources of water change, but the routine stays procedural: fill, offer, watch intake, because nobody wants to discover thirst by watching a bear start chewing equipment. Prentice keeps the bucket near the same spot each day, building a stable queue, because animals learn locations and patterns faster than they learn intentions. Restraint evolves as his body evolves, because physics doesn't negotiate with affection. Earlier photographs show light leashes that could plausibly control a young animal. By 1944, the company uses steel chain at night and during high-risk movements, looping it around a truck axle or a post because a bear can snap a tent stake like kindling. Prentice and other handlers rig an improvised harness, often built from heavy vehicle straps, to steer the animal by torso rather than by neck, because a bear's neck is basically engineered for fighting. When the camp is static long enough, men erect a crude pen with posts and fencing, not as a humane zoo enclosure but as a perimeter that keeps the bear from wandering into sentry lines. Each change in hardware is a response to an incident that didn't quite happen, and the absence of catastrophe becomes the metric of success. Transport keeps trying to kill the arrangement because transport is where routine breaks and panic sneaks in. On lorries, the bear's weight shifts with every rut, and soldiers wedge crates and spare tires to keep him from sliding into sharp edges, because a cut can go septic fast when you're sleeping in dirt. In Italy, trains become the next improvisation. Men load Wojtek into an open freight car because it's what exists, then discover that sharing space with horses triggers exactly the evolutionary response you'd predict. Horses flare nostrils, rear, and kick at the smell of predator. Handlers separate the animals as soon as they can, moving the bear to his own space. And the lesson is not philosophical but practical. The bear survives because people keep correcting failure modes before they become blood. A war supply unit becomes, accidentally, a rolling animal transport lab, run by tired men with no margin for error. Veterinary care arrives as borrowed competence, because no army issues a bear care manual with rifle oil. A Polish army veterinarian, primarily responsible for horses, inspects Wojtek when ringworm or parasites flare, dabs iodine on irritated skin, and makes notes brief enough to fit in a field log that was never designed for a bear entry. Soldiers do the maintenance work like the primates they are. They groom him, pick ticks and fleas with fingers and pocket knives, and flick parasites into the dirt, because disease spreads fastest where bodies are crowded and hygiene is improvisation. Accounts describe vaccinations for rabies and other diseases as a precaution, a sensible move in a camp where the bear has dozens of close contact interactions and one bite could trigger a public health panic. They do not declaw or defang him. The unit manages risk socially and mechanically, trusting habit, handler skill, and hardware rather than mutilation. Every checkup is a quiet admission that the bear is not just a story. He is a living organism that can get sick on schedule like anyone else. Small injuries force the relationship out of legend and into medical procedure. In one widely repeated camp-level incident from the Middle East to Italy period, Wojtek steps on glass, splits a pad, and leaves blood on the ground that makes men stop joking and start moving like medics. A company orderly rinses the wound, wraps it with a bandage as if he were dressing a human hand, and then faces the predictable second problem. The bear mouths the bandage because animals chew at foreign objects on their skin. Prentice distracts him with honey, keeping the bear's attention busy long enough for clotting and pressure to do their work, because in a field setting you solve behavior with whatever reward is available. The incident survives in memory not because it's cute, but because it's a real constraint. A wounded paw can turn a mobile mascot into an immobile liability in days. Crossing borders with a bear turns quarantine into a stamp-based fiction. In peacetime, an imported bear would trigger inspections meant to stop rabies and parasites at the gate. In 1944, Allied logistics moves faster than biosecurity because troop movement has priority. Chelkowski leans on the paperwork, Private Wojtek, the manifest line that lists one bear, to file him under military transport instead of civilian import, and the gatekeepers accept the category because categories keep the flow moving. The paperwork doesn't make the bear safe, it makes him movable, and if he ever gets separated from the unit, the system may not let him back in. Prentice treats every checkpoint like a potential point of permanent loss, tightening the leash and keeping the bear close, because the war can erase living things with a single administrative shrug. As the company creeps closer to the Gustav line around Casino in spring 1944, the bear's nervous system becomes a variable that has to be managed like fuel. Artillery flashes and pressure waves roll across the Liri Valley, and even hardened men flinch when a salvo starts close, because startle reflexes don't care about medals. Wojtek has been gradually exposed to convoys, training fires, and camp clamor across Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, and now Italy, and that exposure raises his panic threshold the way repeated non-injury raises anyone's tolerance. Prentice still times his release from chain and crate to quieter windows, slips the muzzle on when unfamiliar Allied patrols cut through the rear area, and keeps him behind the supply echelons, where danger still exists but silhouettes are less likely to be mistaken for targets. All that maintenance answers the question of why anyone keeps doing it without needing romance. The bear is useful because the bear changes human behavior under stress. After a night run hauling ammunition and fuel, Men return to a bivouac with mud on their boots and cordite in their noses, and they sit beside Wojtek and put hands on fur because touch is a stress regulator that doesn't require permission from military culture. They wrestle him in controlled play, hands on shoulders, feet planted, rules enforced by handlers, because play is a way to metabolize fear without admitting you're afraid. The bear sprawls in the dirt like he owns the planet, and the sight gives exhausted soldiers a non-verbal cue that life can still contain something other than orders and loss. In an exile army shaped by displacement and years of movement, that small reallocation of attention shows up as better sleep and fewer fractures inside the unit, the kind of morale you can measure only by watching what doesn't break. The ritual works precisely because it is predictable, and predictability is rare in a campaign that has been one relocation after another since 1942. Prentice clips the leash the same way every time, checks muzzle straps the way he checks a buckle, and uses the same short commands because animals learn patterns, not speeches. The repetition turns a dangerous creature into a shared project, and shared projects glue units together better than patriotic slogans when the homeland is unreachable. It also gives the company an identity that can be carried like a patch even before any patch exists. They are the men who keep a bear alive under military constraints, which becomes a story that can survive when other stories get too heavy to tell. When a new soldier enters the unit, he learns the rules not by hearing them but by watching hands move, clip, tighten, step back, until the choreography becomes unit culture. Occasional labor drops out of that companionship almost as a byproduct, and it starts with imitation. In camp, men heft wooden crates and ammunition boxes from trucks to stacks, and Wojtek watches the repeated motion the way intelligent mammals watch any routine, as a thing to copy. If a handler praises him when he grips a box, if a treat appears when he carries it even a few steps, the behavior gets reinforced, action rewarded becomes action repeated. Bears have the strength to make carrying look easy at loads that would strain a human back, but the limiting factor is motivation. The 20-second benefits from an animal that wants to join in, not from a perfect pack animal drilled like a mule. That is the moment Wojtek's training becomes a mirror held up to human cognition, and it is not always flattering. The bear lifts because he can and because it earns attention. The men interpret the lifting as loyalty. The interpretation makes the bear more valuable, and increased value makes them invest more calories, more time, and more bureaucratic bending to keep him alive. The loop is cybernetic. Action produces reward, reward produces repetition, repetition produces reliability, reliability produces institutional tolerance. Each time the unit repeats the story of what the bear did, the story becomes a constraint on future behavior, because now everyone is invested in keeping the living symbol alive long enough to justify the words. None of this requires bear patriotism, it only requires mammalian learning and human hunger for meaning. Ethical friction shows up not in abstract lectures but in the click of a chain lock. Prentice loops steel around a post, checks links for wear, and locks Wojtek down because if the bear wanders into a neighboring camp, someone will shoot first and the paperwork will be written over a corpse. Chelkowski signs forms that keep the animal with the unit, and those signatures carry Wojtek deeper into artillery country where the ground shakes and the air tastes metallic after bombardment. Restraint prevents biting, muzzles prevent panic casualties, crates prevent a stampede on a ship, and each safety measure is also a reminder that the bear never volunteered for any of it. The men's care is real and continuous, food measured, wounds cleaned, risks managed, and so is the underlying truth that the bear is being used because he can be. By spring 1944, the Italian campaign has settled into a rhythm of mud, bivouacs, and long nightly supply pushes toward the front, and the 22nd Company turns the bear's maintenance into another checklist alongside fuel levels and tire pressure. Prentice measures out food, checks water, fits harness, tests chain, and walks Wojtek in a tight radius so he can move without drifting into danger, while trucks idle in darkness with blackout lights hooded. Somewhere in the unit files, Private Wojtek remains an improbable entry that has to keep matching reality every day or else the absurdity isn't worth the risk. The men climb back into the lorries, engines take up their load, and the bear follows the moving den again to the familiar sound of engines and the pull of a leash. A Bedford lorry idled with its blackout lights hooded down to slits, and its engine shook the stacked wooden crates just enough to make every nail squeak like a confession. Men from the 22nd Artillery Supply Company slid off the tailboard, boots skidding on wet limestone that had been crushed into flour by weeks of tracks and shelling, and they leaned their shoulders under the first crate to test the weight before committing their spines. Each box was a problem with corners, rough timber, metal banding, stenciled markings half smeared by rain, and inside it the calm, dense geometry of artillery shells that would not forgive a drop onto rock. A corporal shouted a count in Polish over the thud of distant guns, and another man flashed a shutter torch at the mule trail ahead, tracing a route that existed only because exhausted engineers had hacked it into the slope with picks and curses. A bear that had been chained to keep him from wandering into trouble solved that chain with the same blunt patience he used on ropes and tent flaps, and the link rattled against the truck rail when he rose. He moved like a piece of heavy furniture that had decided to become mobile, paws placing carefully on ground that shifted underfoot, ears flicking at each new concussion as if he was sampling the night for pattern. The men didn't invite him with speeches, they made room by stepping sideways, because nobody wants to be the one who blocks the path of a 200+ kilogram animal in a narrow supply corridor when everyone is already jumpy with rifles and flare light. He paused at the tailboard, lifted his muzzle to the smell of pine boards and cordite and diesel, and then did the simplest thing in the world. He copied the motion he'd watched 1,000 times, leaning his chest into a crate and wrapping both forelimbs around it until the box disappeared in a bear hug. The crate didn't float, it bit into fur, and you could see the physics in the way his shoulder muscles bunched and his hind legs braced on the slope before he stepped forward. A human team carries a 40-kilogram box by distributing load through arms, shoulders, and teamwork, but a bear carries by turning the whole torso into a clamp, forelimbs as straps, sternum as a shelf, and the hips as the real engine. That configuration is clumsy and brilliant at once. It blocks his lower field of view, forces him into a slow, deliberate gait, and keeps the center of mass close to his own so he doesn't topple when the ground tilts. A sergeant sucked in air through his teeth and held his hands out, not to catch anything. Nobody catches a 40-kilo crate falling off a bear, but to signal the men behind him to stop moving until the big animal cleared the pinch point. German shellfire stitched the valley in irregular timing that made everybody predict the wrong beat, and the air smelled of wet stone and explosive residue, the ugly perfume of Operation Diadem's final shove. Flare light went up and turned the whole slope into a black and white photograph for a few seconds, and in that bleach-white glare the silhouette was so wrong it looked like a hallucination made out of fatigue. Men in helmets bent under boxes, and behind them a bear upright, hauling one alone. Someone, British attached artillerymen, veterans later insisted, froze mid-step and stared long enough that his own load nearly tipped, and his partner yanked him back into motion with a swear and a shoulder. The bear didn't lurch or panic. He kept walking because the act he was performing was not a moral decision. It was a practiced sequence reinforced by years of human delight and by the simple primate rule that joining the group's activity earns attention and food. At the forward point where crates were being dumped into a rough stack behind a low stone wall, the men cleared space by kicking aside loose rocks with their boots and ramming planks down to make a flatter landing. The bear reached the wall, lowered his arms, and let the crate settle with a thud that sounded like a safe choice. He didn't drop it, and that detail shows up in veteran memory for a reason. A drop would have splintered wood and scattered shells, and even though unfused rounds don't spontaneously detonate from clumsiness, they can crack, deform, or make the kind of sharp, ringing impact that convinces frightened humans they are about to die. One man pried the lid with a bayonet tip, another slid shells out in a practiced rhythm, and the bear turned without ceremony and walked back down the lane for another crate, moving like he'd just been assigned to the job and accepted it without understanding the sentence. The most responsible version of this night is not that he carried, all day, or, to the front line, because the battlefield punishes exaggeration by turning it into propaganda. The credible scene is tighter, a supply point behind the gun line, hours of work, multiple trips, and enough witnesses across Polish and British eyes that the story didn't need to rely on a single memory to survive. British soldier John Clark later described the shock of seeing a bear under fire carrying ammunition, and Polish veterans from the 22nd repeated the same core choreography in memoirs and interviews, which is why historians can treat the act as substantiated even without the kind of photograph modern brains crave. Cameras were busy filming him wrestling in safer moments in Italy in 1944, because combat resupply in darkness is where you send crates, not cinematographers. War selects what becomes visible by killing the men who linger. When a new truck arrived, its driver backed it in by inches, using hand signals because blackout rules made headlights a betrayal, and the tailboard banged down like a gavel. Men formed a chain, each pair lifting a crate, shuffling it to the next pair, and the bear inserted himself into the choreography as if he'd found the missing step. That insertion mattered because it changed who had to be in the open. Every additional set of arms, even furred ones, is a marginal reduction in exposure time when shells are hunting movement. A corporal shouted at the bear not in Polish grammar but in tone, short, sharp, familiar, because animals learn cadence and intent long before they learn vocabulary, and the bear moved when the voice moved. He carried again, and each trip he completed without incident made the men less afraid of his presence around live ordnance, which is how a dangerous improvisation becomes normalized, one successful repetition at a time. By dawn the slope stank of hot metal and churned soil, and the men's hands were raw where splinters had embedded under nails, but the gun positions above them still demanded feeding. Infantry fights are remembered by maps and flags, artillery fights are remembered by the fact that the barrels don't stop firing, and those barrels don't keep firing unless someone keeps carrying weight uphill. That is why the Bears Act lodged itself so hard inside the unit's memory. It happened in the one domain where the 22nd could claim competence without needing romantic language. A supply company's heroism is measured in throughput under threat, and a bear that increases throughput, even briefly, becomes an icon because he makes their work legible to outsiders who otherwise ignore it. On the 18th of May, 1944, when the Polish flag was raised over the shattered Abbey ruins at Monte Cassino, the gesture didn't erase casualty lists, it just gave the living a place to aim their pride. Men in the 2nd Corps, under General Ladislaw Anders, had paid a price for the right to say they took that ground, and they did it in the glare of Allied politics that constantly questioned what an exiled Polish army was for. In that climate, the Bears' story became instantly useful, not as a joke but as proof of something harder to argue against: cohesion. When reporters and visiting officers asked what kept these displaced men moving through mud and rock and wire, someone could point at a bear and say, effectively, we can still build a family out of this. The transformation from event to symbol began the way military transformations always do. A man sat down with a pencil and turned a scene into a graphic that could survive. In late May 1944, while the unit was still processing what it had just lived through, someone in the 22nd sketched a bear carrying an artillery shell as a silhouette, a shape simple enough to be recognized at a glance and crude enough to be reproducible on cloth. Another man cut a stencil from whatever stiff material was available, probably cardboard or thin sheet, and a third dabbed black paint onto a scrap of fabric because official patches take time and wars do not. The moment the first patch dried, the story stopped needing a storyteller, it could walk around on a sleeve. Approval wasn't magic either, it was paper moving up a chain of command that had survived everything except boredom. Unit insignia are not doodles, they are regulated identity, and someone at headquarters had to decide this bear and shell device didn't violate uniform rules or embarrass the Corps. That decision is a kind of institutional signature, the military equivalent of saying, yes, we accept this narrative as part of our public face. When the patches were properly produced by summer 1944 and men began sewing them on, each needle puncture made the Bears' action retroactively real, in the way bureaucracies like. It became standardized, repeatable, and visible on parade. After Cassino, soldiers did what soldiers always do when a ridiculous thing happens and survives contact with reality: they test it for reuse. Men handed the bear empty crates around camp, not because they needed him to work in peacetime moments but because repetition turns novelty into routine, and routine turns an animal into a predictable component. They rewarded him with voice and touch and whatever treats were available, and he responded because bears are not philosophers, they are opportunists with excellent memory. The behavior didn't become trained in the formal sense with a manual, it became stabilized as a game that happened to mirror labor, and in a logistics unit the line between game and job is thin. That stabilization produced its own safety regime, because an adult Syrian brown bear at roughly 250 kilograms is a walking hazard even when he is gentle. Men used chains and makeshift muzzles not as cruelty but as a way to keep him from being shot by an unfamiliar sentry or from responding to a sudden stimulus with the only tools he had, teeth and claws. Someone with veterinary responsibility, usually a man trained for horses, inspected him and treated routine problems like parasites and skin irritation with what the unit carried: iodine, grooming, basic restraint. The fact that they did not declaw or defang him meant they chose to manage risk through human behavior, keeping him exercised, fed, and socially integrated, rather than through mutilation, which is a moral choice that still leaves the animal trapped in human dependence. The legend, of course, didn't stay politely within those boundaries, because legends are what humans do with events once they outlive the threat that produced them. Some retellings claimed he was promoted to corporal after Cassino, a flourish that survives because it hits the listener's reward center. A bear given rank feels like justice. The trouble is that promotions require orders, and no formal military order has been found elevating him, which suggests the corporal title was unit humor that hardened into public fact. But hardening is not malicious, it's a symptom of how humans translate affection into bureaucracy because bureaucracy is the only language our institutions respect. If you want to watch myth formation in real time, don't stare at the bear, stare at the humans handling the paperwork around him. A clerk can list one bear, Wojtek, on a transport manifest with the same pen used for ammunition and rations, and the act of listing creates an illusion of equivalence, as if a bear and a man are both simply personnel. A lieutenant can mention "our bear" in a communication to London because it makes the core seem vivid and human in a world of abstraction, and that mention can be picked up by press looking for something, anything, that isn't another column of dead. Each time the bear enters a document, the story becomes harder to kill, because documents are the objects memory clings to when witnesses disperse. The bear's singularity also depended on an unglamorous fact: he survived long enough to be seen by the right eyes at the right times. A bear doing a thing under fire is impressive. A bear doing a thing under fire and then living to be photographed and visited and written about is how you get cultural permanence. Many units had mascots that vanished into a ditch or a stray bullet or a post-war "we can't keep feeding this animal," and those mascots became footnotes because there was no body left to point at. Wojtek became a moving anchor for memory because the war didn't kill him and because his handlers kept solving the daily problems that could have killed him instead. And when you put Wojtek beside the other animals that drift through military history, the selection effect becomes almost rude in its clarity. Somewhere in the First World War, sailors hauled a pig out of the sea and named it Tirpitz, then turned the animal into a trophy narrative because trophies are easier than mourning. The pig's fame was portable because it fit on a postcard. In South Africa in 1915, a baboon named Jackie was shoved into uniform ritual because primate mimicry and bored soldiers make a combustible mix. And the baboon story stuck because photographs exist and because "baboon salutes officer" is narratively irresistible. In Korea in the early 1950s, Marines led a Mongolian mare nicknamed Sergeant Reckless through ammunition runs because she had 4 legs, a high pain tolerance, and handlers who turned habit into reliability, and her documentation is thick enough to satisfy skeptical historians. None of these cases are the same, but they rhyme in a way that reveals the human mechanism. We elevate the animal that comes with a good photograph, a neat anecdote, and a unit willing to keep repeating it. There were also other bears, which is the part that ruins the fantasy that Wojtek was a one-time miracle. Polish soldiers adopted another bear cub named Mikhail with the 16th Rifle Battalion, and that story ends early because the bear bit men and had to be sent away to a zoo in Tel Aviv in 1943. A reminder that the cute bear mascot plan has failure modes. Other armies and airmen collected bear cubs briefly and then discarded them when the animal grew large enough to be a liability, which is how you end up with a pattern of wartime mascots that evaporate at adolescence. Wojtek's endurance inside the unit was therefore not a proof of bears being secretly eager to enlist. It was proof that a particular bear, socialized early, handled by specific men, and kept inside a stable routine, didn't tip into the kinds of aggression that would have forced a hard decision. The men themselves supplied the final ingredient in that selection effect: they needed him to be memorable. The Polish Second Corps was an exile formation assembled out of catastrophe, deportation, Soviet imprisonment, forced marches, and it carried the constant wound of not knowing what home would mean after the war. When you live inside that uncertainty, you grab onto symbols that don't require a parliament or a border to exist, and a bear with a name is an almost perfect portable homeland. A bear doesn't argue about politics, he just keeps showing up where your people are, and in that showing up he becomes a creature you can love without having to adjudicate the future. After Cassino, the Corps kept moving north through Italy because wars don't stop when you get a photographable victory, they just shift the location of exhaustion. Trucks drove through dust and then through rain, and men kept lifting crates because the supply chain is a moral engine only in retrospect. In real time it is just bodies moving matter. The bear rode in those vehicles because he had been habituated to vibration and engine noise, and because his handlers had solved the practical problem of restraint without provoking panic. That habituation has a biological logic. Repeated exposure to loud noise paired with safety can blunt the startle response, and a bear raised in an artillery unit learns, in the only way a bear can, that thunder does not always mean death. But victory did not come with a clean demobilization for exiles, and by 1946 the problem changed from, how do we use this bear, to, who owns this bear? Some accounts tried to dramatize the move north with a story about an RAF plane, because humans love airlift imagery, but the colder evidence points to ship movement from Italy to Glasgow in late October 1946 with one bear, Wojtek, listed as cargo attached to the Polish contingent. Men built or reinforced a travel enclosure because a full-grown bear needs more than a crate, he needs a structure that will not fail under boredom, fear, or simple curiosity. Handlers read his agitation in posture and breathing because a bear doesn't announce, I'm stressed, in words, he telegraphs it in pacing, head position, and the sudden stillness that precedes a lunge. When the ship docked and the bear's cage was lifted by crane, the war did a final trick of perspective. It made the victorious look like refugees anyway. Poland was under Soviet control, repatriation carried political risks, and the men of Anders' army were steered into the UK's resettlement machinery, which could handle soldiers but had no Category 4 soldiers bear, except as an administrative headache. In the autumn of 1946, the 22nd ended up at Winfield Camp, a former RAF airfield in Berwickshire repurposed as a Polish resettlement camp, and the Bear's world shrank from moving fronts to a fence line. About 300 Polish soldiers and families lived there, and they built the Bear a large wooden pen as a base because even in peacetime you don't leave a bear loose without a plan. The camp made its own rituals out of the new quiet, and the bear became the most conspicuous ritual object. Soldiers played tug-of-war with him using ropes salvaged from old parachutes, bracing their boots in grass and leaning back until their shoulders burned, because strength contests are universal language when speech fails. Children watched from safe distances and sometimes reached fingers through slats to touch fur, a gesture that looks innocent until you remember a bear can crush bone by shifting his weight. The bear stole sausages from the duty cook's kitchen when he found a door left open, and the theft was funny only because the cook chose retreat over confrontation. That's the real discipline in the scene. Humans learning when not to enforce rules because the rule breaker weighs as much as a refrigerator and has teeth. Feeding him in post-war austerity Britain became a political act disguised as affection. Meat and sugar allocations were already strained, and every kilogram diverted to a bear was a kilogram not eaten by a human, which meant his continued care depended on communal consent. The Polish-Scottish Association in Glasgow raised funds to help feed him, turning the bear into a cross-cultural fundraising mascot because money is the only argument that satisfies supply problems. In a gesture that is equal parts comedy and grief management, the association granted him honorary membership, filing paperwork that effectively said, yes, this bear belongs to our community too, because when your country is lost you will adopt a bear as a compatriot and sign the form with a straight face. Demobilization accelerated in 1947, and the bear's handlers faced the kind of decision war postpones but never erases. Men dispersed for work, emigrated, married, tried to become ordinary, and each departure removed one more familiar voice from the bear's social map. The UK government and the Polish Resettlement Corps discussed options with the ruthless pragmatism of officials who do not get to indulge nostalgia. Release into the wild was not feasible. Return to Poland was politically impossible. A dedicated facility had no obvious funding path, and a zoo, however morally complicated, was at least an institution with fences that insurers understand. The bear's future was decided the way many animal futures are decided, by which institutions exist. Zoo officials visited Winfield in autumn 1947 and assessed the bear the way a military inspector assesses equipment, condition, temperament, risk. The often repeated detail that he slurped tea from a teapot during the visit persists because it compresses a whole history into one absurd action. A wild animal trained into human rituals so thoroughly that even a porcelain object becomes a mouth target. They found him in generally good health, which means his handlers had kept him fed and relatively stable through the transition from war to camp, and they arranged the transfer with the kind of logistical care that sounds tender only because it involves a bear instead of a rifle. The date is fixed because newspapers and zoo registers like fixedness, the 15th of November, 1947. On that day, a lorry backed up to the pen and men reattached chains and opened gates with hands that shook for reasons they didn't want to name. Piotr Prentice, the bear's primary handler through the war, rode with him to Edinburgh because nobody sane drops a bear into a new enclosure without a familiar human in the transport, and another veteran, Corporal Zygon, came along because grief needs witnesses. The Scottish press treated the event as civic news, and the Edinburgh Evening News quoted a former Polish lieutenant saying farewell to our faithful friend, language that refuses to claim the bear is human while insisting he belongs in the unit's moral accounting. The bear's body became public property in a new way, no longer a comrade in a closed camp, but an exhibit in Scotland's capital. At the zoo gate on Corstorphine Hill, the bear did not perform heroism, he performed confusion. He reportedly refused to leave the truck at first until Prentice led him, which reads like stubbornness until you frame it as a mammal resisting a context shift it cannot predict. When the chains were removed and the enclosure gate closed, the most cited behavior is not aggression but contact. The bear licked Prentice's face goodbye, a gesture that can be grooming and reassurance in animal terms and becomes, in human terms, a final sentence. Some accounts add a harsher image of him trying to follow, climbing the fence and calling, and whether every detail is exact or not, the asymmetry is exact. The humans could walk away into new lives, and the bear could only be moved between enclosures. Edinburgh Zoo recorded the arrival in its register for 1947, noting Wojtek, Polish soldier bear, as a donation from the Polish Resettlement Corps, which is the kind of institutional line that pins a myth to a place and date with a bureaucrat's indifference. From then on, the bear's days ran on public schedules, Feeding times, cleaning routines, crowds pressing close to see the famous animal that had allegedly carried shells at Monte Cassino. The enclosure was safety translated into bars, and it changed his life the way all captivity changes lives. It reduced his world to predictable limits and turned his agency into pacing. Visitors came because they wanted the war story without the war, and the bear obliged by existing, a living exhibit label. Polish veterans visited him because they needed a physical anchor for a past that was otherwise dissolving into jobs, marriages, and new languages. Men walked up to the fence and spoke Polish to him, and keepers noticed he responded differently to those voices, lifting his head, shifting his weight, moving toward the sound, because mammals are made to recognize familiar auditory patterns. A Scottish family could ask a zookeeper why that bear seemed special and receive the only answer that makes sense in a place like this: "He used to be a soldier," a sentence that solves the listener's curiosity and creates a new discomfort in the same breath. The bear's meaning was now being translated for strangers by staff who had never hauled a crate under shellfire and never marched in exile, and that translation did what translations always do: it simplified. Time did what it does to every animal used as a symbol: it wore the body out while the story stayed shiny. The bear lived 16 years in the zoo, from late 1947 until the 2nd of December, 1963, and the end came not with a heroic tableau but with veterinary procedure. He developed an esophageal growth that made eating impossible, and staff watched his intake drop, his weight shift, and his behavior change in the quiet ways pain announces itself in animals. A clinical decision ended his suffering because humans recognize suffering most readily when it interferes with feeding, and the bear was euthanized in Edinburgh, not because the story demanded tragedy but because biology eventually demands an exit. His death was reported by BBC Radio and in newspapers including The Scotsman, which called him an old soldier bear, a phrase that is tender and also exposes the human compulsion to keep pulling animals into our categories even when the animal is gone. He was cremated, leaving no taxidermied body, no preserved skull for skeptics to measure, no relic in a museum case that could be used as proof by touch. Former comrades installed a plaque in 1965, doing what humans do when they can't keep a body: they keep a surface, a bit of metal and engraving, something that sits in the world and refuses to forget. Decades later, Edinburgh Zoo placed another memorial plaque in 2013 near his old enclosure because institutions, too, have learned that memory is a resource worth cultivating. Once the breathing animal vanished, the story entered its most volatile phase, because there was no longer an organism pushing back against our projections by simply being itself. You can track that volatility in the media trail as if it were a set of footprints in damp sand. Scottish newspapers in late 1945 described Polish parades that included a bear marching with soldiers, forcing local readers to process the strange fact of an exile army living among them. The 1947 handover turned into civic theatre with quotes and photographs while witnesses were still alive. By 1950, a BBC radio programme about unusual war stories could broadcast the casino anecdote as entertainment, which tells you the legend had already stabilized enough to be consumed casually by people who would never smell casino's mud. Participant narratives then did what participant narratives always do: they hardened memory into canon. Wisław Lasocki published Wojtek spod Monte Cassino in London in 1968 for a Polish émigré audience that needed its own versions of the war not filtered through Soviet politics, and Geoffrey Morgan and Lasocki followed with Soldier Bear in 1970, carrying the bear into English-language readership. Those books preserved sequences, names, and the emotional texture of care, but they also smoothed uncertainty into plot because communities don't like ragged edges in the stories that keep them alive. The bear's life became a vehicle for diaspora identity, and vehicles, by definition, are designed to carry something other than themselves. Cold War politics then acted like an editor with a censor's pencil. In communist Poland, the story was suppressed because it was tied to Anders Army, a formation the regime treated as inconvenient, which meant a generation grew up without the bear as a national symbol. In the West, the story percolated among émigré groups and in British memory, appearing in periodic press pieces and oral retellings that turned the bear into a shorthand for Polish sacrifice that didn't require arguments about borders. After 1989, when Poland could publicly reclaim wartime narratives without Soviet veto, Wojciech's tale surged into broader Polish culture, amplified by writers like Eileen or and by historians and institutions that added friction against pure invention, insisting on documents like enlistment paperwork and the unit emblem as anchors. Commemoration then did its favorite trick: it turned a messy, contingent history into an object you can stand beside. A Scottish-based charitable trust, the Wojtek Memorial Trust, formed in 2008 with an educational mission, and it raised money, negotiated permissions, and commissioned art because modern memory requires infrastructure. Memorials appeared in a sequence that mapped diaspora and return. Krakow's Park Jordana received a statue in 2014, placing the bear back on Polish soil in bronze long after the living bear could never return. And Edinburgh's Prince's Street Gardens unveiled a larger bronze in 2015 showing a Polish soldier walking alongside the bear carrying a shell. People came with cameras and flags and speeches because public memory likes ceremonies, and because the 20th century taught Europe that if you don't ritualize your dead you get haunted in politics instead. At an unveiling like that, someone always reaches out and touches the cold metal as if contact could transmit understanding, and a child's hand on a bronze paw becomes an accidental lesson about how history is built. The sculptor freezes the bear mid-stride, muscles forever tensed, and the shell becomes a permanent prop that weighs nothing and yet stands for 40 kilograms of wood and metal carried on a night when the air itself hit like a fist. Veterans, when any was still alive to attend, lifted shaking hands in salutes not because the bear deserved military respect in his own comprehension but because saluting is a human technology for turning pain into structure. The bear's story survives because humans keep handling it, printing it, sculpting it, teaching it, and each time they do, they are doing the same thing the supply company did on that slope in May 1944, moving weight under constraint, because the weight doesn't move itself.